Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. I've always found peace in the rhythm of engines and the smell of motor oil, but that night changed everything. The fluorescent lights of Reynolds' auto shop buzzed overhead as I worked on Mrs. Peterson's Chevy, the only sound competing with the desert wind whistling through the garage's worn weather stripping. Dad used to say these late hours were when mechanics did their best thinking, and since his passing last month, I'd fallen into the habit of working well past midnight, finding solace in the familiar tools that still bore his fingerprints. The first crash came at 2:17 a.m., the sound of metal crushing metal. Glass shattering and tires screeching ripped through the quiet night with such violence that I dropped my wrench, convinced a major collision had occurred right outside. My heart pounding, I rushed to the garage door, my steel-toed boots echoing against the concrete floor, but when I yanked it open, the street stretched empty in both directions, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium lights. Nothing moved except tumbleweeds scratching their way across the asphalt. I was still standing there, trying to make sense of what I'd heard, when the second crash tore through the night. This time, I could have sworn I heard screaming mixed with the cacophony of destruction. Again, I found nothing but empty streets and silence so profound it made my ears ring. That's when I noticed something odd about the old accident photos Dad kept pinned to his office wall, particularly the one from the Martinez case back in '85. The wreckage in the photo seemed to shift slightly. Like a television with poor reception, the third crash brought with it the distinct smell of burning rubber and gasoline, so strong I could taste it on my tongue. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was seeping from the walls themselves, from the very foundation of the shop that had been in my family for 3 generations. When I returned to Mrs. Peterson's Chevy, my hands shaking as I picked up the fallen wrench, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh scratches across the driver's side door, deep gouges in the metal that hadn't been there minutes ago. Dad's old logbook caught my eye from its permanent spot on the workbench. I'd never paid much attention to it before, but now something compelled me to open its worn leather cover. The entries were typical at first. Customer names, dates, repair details. But as I flipped through the pages, I noticed a pattern emerging. Every major accident he'd worked on over the years had occurred on the same date. March 15th, today's date. The lights flickered then, and in that moment of darkness I heard something that wasn't quite a crash. More like the echo of one, playing backward, accompanied by the sound of dragging metal. When the light stabilized, I found myself staring at the shop's back wall, where shadows danced despite the absence of movement. And there, written in what looked like grease but couldn't have been, were 5 words that made my heart stop. "You're next, son. Keep fixing." After that first night, I couldn't stop digging through Dad's old records. The logbook had become my obsession, each page revealing more questions than answers. The accidents he documented weren't just coincidences. They were connected by more than their dates. Each victim had brought their vehicle in for repairs exactly 1 week before their crash. And in every case, Dad had noted the same cryptic symbol in the margins. A twisted gear wrapped around what looked like a human eye. The deeper I dug into the shop's history, the more disturbing the pattern became. Hidden behind decades of invoices, I found newspaper clippings dating back to when my grandfather first opened the shop in 1952. Each article detailed fatal accidents. But something wasn't right about the photos. The vehicles were crushed in identical patterns, despite being different makes and models, as if they'd all encountered the same invisible force at the exact same angle. It was while examining these clippings that I found the letter, yellowed with age and sealed with red wax bearing that same gear and eye symbol. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, releasing a musty odor that reminded me of old graves. The letter was from my grandfather to my father, dated 1 day before Grandpa's supposed heart attack. "The price of our success must be paid," it read. "1 soul per year, collected through steel and speed. Break the chain, and everything we've built crumbles. The shop must stay open. The repairs must continue. The revelation sent me stumbling into the garage's back room, where we kept our oldest records. There, beneath stacks of manuals and parts catalogues, I discovered a hidden compartment in the floor. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my grandfather's handwriting. The first entry described a desperate man about to lose everything in the Great Depression, and a stranger who offered him a deal, prosperity in exchange for service. My grandfather had signed the contract in blood, binding not just himself, but all future generations of our family. That's when I heard it, the sound of an engine starting up in the empty garage. But this wasn't just any engine noise. It was the combined roar of every vehicle that had ever been destroyed in those mysterious crashes. The sound grew until the walls shook, and through the doorway, I could see every car in the shop had come alive, their headlights blazing with an unnatural blue glow, their metal bodies vibrating with malevolent energy. The journal's final pages revealed the true nature of our family's curse. We weren't just mechanics. We were caretakers of a dark machine, one that fed on the souls of those marked for collection. Each repair we made was more than just fixing a car, it was preparing a vessel for harvest. And now, with Dad gone, I was next in line to continue this gruesome tradition. The crashes I'd been hearing weren't echoes of the past. They were previews of what would happen if I tried to break the cycle. I started tracking down survivors from the old accidents, those who had walked away when others hadn't. Most refused to talk, their eyes going wide with fear at the mention of Reynolds Auto Shop. But Linda Martinez, whose husband died in that '85 crash, finally agreed to meet over coffee in her kitchen. Her hands clutching a rosary, she told me what really happened that night. Her husband's car hadn't just crashed. It had been driven off the road by a phantom vehicle that disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only the smell of sulfur and burning metal. As Linda spoke, the lights in her kitchen began to flicker, and a low humming filled the air. Through her window, I could see her garage door trembling. Though there was no wind, when she noticed my gaze, her face went pale. "It never stops," she whispered. "Every night at the exact time of Miguel's crash, my car's engine turns over by itself. I had it towed away last month, but I still hear it. Sometimes I see Miguel in the driveway, covered in oil instead of blood, trying to warn me about something." The pattern started becoming clearer with each person I interviewed. Sarah Chen, whose sister died in '97, showed me photographs that changed slightly every time she looked at them. The wreckage shifting position, the victims' faces transforming from terror to acceptance and back again. Old man Jenkins, who lost his daughter in '03, revealed that his garage had become a portal of sorts, where time didn't flow quite right. He'd walk in to get a tool and emerge hours later, with visions of twisted metal and burning rubber seared into his mind. I found myself back at the shop that night, comparing their stories to Dad's logbook. Each victim had received a special part during their repair, components that Dad had marked with the gear and eye symbol. These weren't just replacement parts, they were conduits for something darker in every case. Dad had installed them exactly 7 days before the crashes, like he was setting a timer on a bomb. The realization made me rush to check Mrs. Peterson's car, still waiting for pickup. There, on the new brake line, barely visible in the fluorescent light, was that damned symbol. The true horror of our family's legacy was finally becoming clear. We weren't just witnessing these accidents or even causing them. We were facilitating a harvest. Each crash was a carefully orchestrated collection, the victims chosen by whatever entity my grandfather had made his deal with. The shop wasn't just a business. It was a temple where sacrifices were prepared, and we were its reluctant priests. As this revelation settled over me, every vehicle in the shop roared to life simultaneously, their headlights blazed with that familiar blue glow, but this time I could see faces in the light. The faces of every victim, their features distorted by pain and betrayal. Through the cacophony of engines and ghostly screams, I heard my father's voice, as clear as if he were standing beside me. "There's a way out, son, but the price is higher than you can imagine." I found myself drawn to the old family mausoleum in the town cemetery, where generations of Reynolds men rested in their metal coffins. an oddity I'd never questioned until now. The dates carved into each tomb told a story. None of my ancestors had lived past their 50th year, each dying in mysterious accidents exactly 1 month after their eldest son's 30th birthday. I was 29 years and 11 months old. The timing wasn't a coincidence, it was a countdown. Inside the mausoleum, behind my father's recently placed nameplate, I discovered a hidden compartment containing a series of carved gears, each one stained dark with what could only be blood. These weren't just decorative pieces, they were keys, crafted from the metal of each fatal crash and imbued with the essence of those sacrificed. The truth hit me like a physical blow. Every repair we'd made was strengthening these mechanical tokens of our curse, building toward something catastrophic. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and the air filled with the sound of distant engines, growing closer with each passing second. Through the mausoleum's small window, I watched in horror as ghostly vehicles began materializing in the cemetery. Every car that had ever been repaired at our shop, now driven by shadows with glowing eyes. They circled the building in an ever-tightening spiral, their phantom wheels leaving trails of blue fire across the graves. My grandfather's journal had mentioned a ritual, a way to break the curse, but the price was unthinkable. It required the willing sacrifice of a Reynolds mechanic, their blood and soul freely given to cancel the original contract. But it couldn't be just any death. It had to occur while working on a vehicle marked with our cursed symbol. At the exact moment when past and present collided, the thought made my stomach turn. But as I watched the phantom parade outside, I realized why Dad had been working so late on that final night. The pieces started falling into place with terrifying clarity. Dad hadn't died of a heart attack as everyone believed. He had tried to break the curse, but something had gone wrong, and instead of ending the cycle, his death had accelerated it. The entity we served wasn't just collecting souls anymore. It was preparing for something bigger. Each crash, each sacrifice, had been building power for a grand design that would turn our entire town into a feeding ground. Standing there among the tombs of my cursed ancestors, I made my decision. I couldn't let Mrs. Peterson or anyone else fall victim to our family's dark legacy. But as I turned to leave, I heard metal grinding against metal, and my father's coffin began to move. The lid slowly opened, revealing not a body, but a perfectly preserved set of mechanics' tools, each one engraved with symbols I'd never seen before. Alongside them was a note in my father's handwriting. "The tools aren't just for fixing cars, son. They're for repairing the broken places between worlds. Use them wisely." I returned to the shop for the last time. Carrying my father's otherworldly tools and the knowledge of what had to be done, Mrs. Peterson's car sat waiting, the cursed brake line pulsing with a faint blue light that only I could see. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until March 15th would end, taking with it my only chance to break the cycle. The air was thick with the smell of oil and ozone, and in the shadows, I could see the phantom vehicles gathering, their spectral forms flickering like bad television reception. The ritual had to be perfect. Using my grandfather's journal as a guide, I began drawing the ancient symbols on the shop floor. Using a mixture of oil and my own blood, each mark triggered a response from the gathering darkness. Screams of metal against metal, the roar of phantom engines, the whispers of those who had died maintaining our cursed legacy. The tools in my father's set began to vibrate, each one resonating with the frequency of the approaching chaos. Time seemed to fold in on itself as midnight approached. Through the growing maelstrom, I could see every accident our family had ever orchestrated playing out simultaneously. Cars crashing and rebuilding themselves in an endless loop. The walls of the shop became transparent, revealing the true nature of our curse. We weren't just taking lives. We were feeding them into a massive mechanical entity that existed between dimensions, using our repairs to maintain its grip on our reality. With trembling hands, I positioned myself under Mrs. Peterson's car, the cursed brake line directly above my heart. The phantoms drew closer, their headlights blazing with hungry anticipation. I could feel the weight of generations pressing down on me, the guilt, the responsibility, the desperate need to end this. But as I raised the sacred wrench, ready to complete the ritual, I heard my father's voice cutting through the chaos. "Not like this. Son, the curse doesn't want a sacrifice. It needs a mechanic." In that moment of clarity, I understood. Every Reynolds had tried to break the curse through death. But the entity didn't want more death. It wanted someone to fix what was broken. With seconds remaining, I began to work, using the mystical tools not to destroy the break line, but to repair the torn fabric of reality around it. Each turn of the wrench sealed another breach. Each tightened bolt closed another portal until the very foundations of the shop began to shake. The entity fought back with everything it had. Spectral cars crashed around me in a symphony of destruction, their drivers reaching out with burning hands. The curse tried to claim me the same way it had claimed my ancestors. But with each proper repair, its power weakened. As the clock struck midnight, I made the final adjustment, not to the car, but to the fundamental mechanics of the curse itself. There was a sound like the universe taking a deep breath, and then everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Peterson's car was whole, unmarked by any cursed symbol. The phantom vehicles had vanished, leaving behind only the faintest scent of ozone. Every repair order in the shop's history had been rewritten, showing only honest work done by honest mechanics. The curse was broken, not by sacrifice, but by doing what the Reynolds family did best, fixing what was broken, even if what was broken was reality itself. The humid Virginia summer clings to my skin as I prepare for another day of tours at the Richmond Colonial Museum. As the lead guide, I've memorized every creak in these ancient floorboards, every whisper these walls could tell. My name is Ruth Mitchell, and I've spent the last 3 years sharing the rich history of this place with visitors from around the world. Today, however, something feels different in the air, heavier somehow, as if the very building is holding its breath. I spot him again during my first morning tour, the same man who's been appearing in my groups for the past week. His attire is impeccable, if oddly formal. A black wool coat despite the heat. A high-collared shirt, and what appears to be period-accurate clothing from the Civil War era. At first, I assumed he was one of those passionate history buffs who can never get enough of these tours. But there's something unsettling about the way he stares, not at the exhibits but through them, as if seeing something entirely different. The tour proceeds as usual through the main gallery, where portraits of Virginia's founding families watch us with painted eyes. I'm explaining the significance of the Mason family's contribution to the local militia when he raises his hand, just as he has every day this week. What happened to the soldiers who disappeared during the winter of 1865, he asks, his voice carrying an odd echo despite the room's modern acoustic treatment. Every time, the same question, delivered with identical inflection. My colleagues think I'm being paranoid when I mention him during our lunch break. Probably just someone doing research, Jessica suggests. But she hasn't noticed how his clothes never change, how he appears and disappears between exhibit rooms without using the doorways, how the temperature drops 10 degrees whenever he's nearby. I've started documenting his appearances, marking them in my daily planner, trying to establish a pattern as the afternoon tour begins. I catch his reflection in one of the display cases. For a split second, his image appears different, older, grayer, with hollow eyes that seem to glow with an inner light. When I turn to look at him directly, he's back to normal, standing at the back of the group with that same patient, unsettling smile. The questions continue, always the same. Always about those missing soldiers. By the end of the day, as I'm locking up the east wing, I hear footsteps behind me in the empty corridor. They match my pace exactly. Stopping when I stop, moving when I move. When I finally gather the courage to turn around, the hallway is empty, but in the window's reflection, I see him standing directly behind me, his smile now a grotesque grin, his eyes completely black. I run, my keys jingling violently in my trembling hands, and don't stop until I'm in my car. Doors locked, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The archives room smells of dust and forgotten memories as I dig through records from 1865. After last night's terrifying encounter, I've called in sick, using my day off to search for answers. The mysterious visitor's question about the missing soldiers has burrowed into my mind like a splinter, refusing to let go. My hands tremble as I carefully flip through brittle pages of old newspapers and military reports. 3 hours into my research, I find something that makes my blood run cold. A yellowed photograph, dated December 1865, shows a group of Confederate officers standing in front of the building that would later become our museum. There, in the back row, stands my visitor, identical in every detail. From his high-collared shirt to the peculiar way he holds his hands clasped in front of him, the caption reads, Cole, James Blackwood and officers, Deck, 15, 1865, final photo before disappearance. My discovery leads me deeper into the archives, where I uncover a series of letters between Colonel Blackwood and his superiors. They detail a secret mission involving Union prisoners and a hidden vault beneath the building. The last letter, dated 3 days after the photograph, mentions a necessary sacrifice for the greater cause. My stomach churns as I read between the lines, sensing something horrific happened here. The temperature in the archive room suddenly plummets, and I hear the familiar sound of footsteps behind me. This time when I turn, he's there. Colonel Blackwood, my mysterious visitor, standing among the shelves. "You're finally beginning to understand," he says, his voice carrying that same otherworldly echo. When I blink, he's gone, but the documents on my desk have rearranged themselves to form an arrow pointing toward the floor. With shaking hands, I pull out my phone and search my family's genealogy website, something tugging at my memory about my grandmother's maiden name. The search results confirm my growing suspicion. There's a Blackwood in my family tree, but not on the Confederate side. The name appears in a Union soldier's diary. Listed among those who vanished without a trace during that fateful winter, the implications hit me like a physical blow as I connect the dots. The missing soldiers, the secret vault, my family connection. It's all intertwined in a web of historical horror. As I pack up the documents, my hand brushes against a leather-bound journal I hadn't noticed before. Inside, in Colonel Blackwood's handwriting, I find detailed accounts of rituals performed in the basement of this building. Rituals involving captured Union soldiers and something he refers to only as the entity. The museum's basement has always been off-limits to visitors, its narrow corridors housing nothing but old furniture and forgotten exhibits. But after discovering Colonel Blackwood's journal, I know I have to explore it. Using my master key, I slip downstairs after closing time, armed with only my flashlight and a growing sense of dread. The journal mentions specific measurements, 20 paces from the east wall, 12 from the north, leading to what he called the chamber. Following his instructions, I find myself facing what appears to be a solid brick wall, but when I press against it in the exact spot mentioned in the journal, something clicks. The wall swings inward with a sound like a dying breath, revealing a hidden room that hasn't seen light in over 150 years. The air that rushes out carries the metallic tang of old blood and something else, something ancient and wrong. My flashlight beam reveals walls covered in strange symbols, their patterns seeming to shift when viewed directly. In the center of the room stands a stone altar, its surface stained with dark patches. I refuse to examine too closely. Scattered around it are personal effects, Union soldier uniforms, pocket watches, letters home that were never sent. Each item tells part of a story I'm becoming increasingly terrified to understand. As I examine the room, my flashlight flickers and dies. In the absolute darkness, I hear his voice, Colonel Blackwood's, whispering from every corner at once. "They had to be sacrificed," he says. "The entity required payment for its power, but one escaped. Your ancestor, he ruined everything." The temperature drops so rapidly I can see my breath in the beam of my phone's weak light. The walls themselves seem to pulse with a sickly green light, revealing more details I wish I couldn't see. Scratch marks on the floor leading to the altar, names carved desperately into the walls, and dates, dozens of them, with the last one listing tomorrow's date. When I look closer at the names, I recognize them. They're all my ancestors, leading down through the generations to my own name, freshly carved. A leather-bound book rests on the altar, its pages filled with entries detailing each sacrifice. The final pages reveal Colonel Blackwood's true purpose, a ritual of immortality powered by the blood of his victims. But my ancestors' escape cursed him to exist as a spirit, endlessly seeking revenge against our bloodline. The last entry, written in what looks like fresh ink, simply states, "The circle will finally close." The revelation of my family's connection to Colonel Blackwood's victims has shaken me to my core. I spend the night researching my ancestor, William Mitchell, the Union soldier who escaped the ritual. His diary, preserved in my grandmother's attic, reveals the full horror of what happened in that basement. He didn't just escape. He interrupted the ritual at a crucial moment, binding Blackwood between life and death. Morning finds me back at the museum, unable to stay away despite the terror clawing at my mind. The regular tours continue, but now I see signs I missed before. Every painting seems to watch me. Every mirror shows fleeting glimpses of soldiers in Union blue, their faces twisted in eternal agony, and always, Colonel Blackwood appears closer each time, his form becoming more solid, more real. During the afternoon tour, he makes his boldest move yet. As I'm leading visitors through the Civil War exhibition, he suddenly materializes in front of the entire group. "Tell them," he commands, his voice audible to everyone. The tourists gasp and back away, phones raised to capture the impossible sight. "Tell them how your blood is the key to finishing what was started." When I refuse, the ghost launches into a rage, sending display cases crashing to the floor. The museum is evacuated, but I stay behind, knowing this has to end. William's diary revealed that Blackwood's ritual required the willing sacrifice of his own bloodline to grant him true immortality. When William escaped, he didn't just interrupt the ritual, he bound Blackwood's spirit to the museum using the Colonel's own blood. Now, generations later, I understand the terrible truth. As both Blackwood's descendant and William's, only my blood can complete or destroy the ritual in a cruel twist of fate. I discover that my recent promotion to lead guide wasn't based on merit at all. Hidden security footage shows Blackwood's spirit manipulating events, eliminating other candidates, ensuring I would be here. Every tour, every question, every appearance was part of his plan to draw me closer to the truth. To make me understand my role in his twisted ritual, the sun sets on my last evening as a normal person, painting the museum's windows in shades of blood red. In the basement chamber, the symbols on the walls pulse with increasing urgency. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the original ritual, the moment when the barrier between Blackwood's spirit and the physical world will be thinnest. As I leave the museum, I catch my reflection in a window, and for a moment, I see Colonel Blackwood's face superimposed over mine, our features blending in a terrifying preview of what's to come. The museum opens early on the anniversary of the original ritual. I arrive before dawn, William's diary clutched in one hand. A vial of my own blood, drawn the night before, in the other. The building seems to breathe around me, its walls pulsing with otherworldly energy. Colonel Blackwood's presence fills every shadow, every reflection, waiting for the perfect moment to strike as the first rays of sunlight pierce the museum's windows. I begin what I announce as a special early morning tour. The guests who arrive are not what they seem. Each one's eyes gleams with the same ethereal light as Blackwood's, revealing them as spirits of his original victims. They follow me silently through the building, their spectral forms growing more solid with each step toward the basement. In the hidden chamber, the altar glows with an unnatural light. Colonel Blackwood finally appears in his full form, no longer bound by reflections and shadows. "Our bloodlines unite in you," he declares, his voice resonating with power. "The ritual will be completed." But as he approaches, I reveal the truth I discovered in William's final diary pages. The ritual was never about immortality, but imprisonment. The entity that Blackwood sought to bargain with had its own agenda. Each sacrifice wasn't meant to grant him power, but to strengthen his bonds to this place. My ancestor William didn't escape by chance. He was chosen by the entity to ensure Blackwood's eternal imprisonment. The spirits of his victims weren't trapped here by his ritual, but by their own choice, waiting through generations for this moment. As Blackwood realizes the truth, the room transforms. The walls become transparent, revealing hundreds more spirits, every victim of his failed attempts to break free over the centuries. My blood isn't meant to complete his ritual. But to seal it permanently, the entity reveals itself at last. Not as a source of power, but as a guardian of balance, using Blackwood's own ambition as the chains of his prison. The final confrontation is a clash between Blackwood's desperate rage and the combined power of his victims' spirits. With my blood as the catalyst, the chamber fills with blinding light as centuries of trapped souls find their release. Their energy binding Blackwood not just to the building, but to a fate far worse than death. Eternal consciousness without the ability to interact with or influence the world around him. In the aftermath, the museum feels different. The hidden chamber seals itself, becoming part of the foundation. The spirits of Blackwood's victims find peace, their presence lingering only in the gentle warmth visitors sometimes feel in certain rooms. I continue giving tours, but now I'm protecting more than just history. I'm the guardian of a prison whose inmate rages in silence, visible only in the briefest of reflections, forever asking questions that will never again be answered. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I made my final round through the subway cars at Canal Street Station, 23 years on the job, and these late-night checks had become as natural as breathing. The empty train always held an eerie silence at 2 a.m., but tonight felt different. The usual hum of the ventilation system seemed muted, replaced by an unsettling stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd already checked this car just 10 minutes ago. Standard procedure before shutdown. Everything had been normal then. Seats aligned in their usual positions, facing the windows like they had for the past 50 years. But as I slid open the door to car 2317, my flashlight beam revealed something impossible. Every single seat in the car had turned to face the center aisle, creating an amphitheater of empty chairs all staring at a central point. My first thought was vandals, but the security cameras would have caught anyone entering the car. Besides, these seats were bolted down. It would take specialized tools and considerable time to move even one, let alone all of them. The metal floor beneath my feet felt unusually cold through my boots as I stepped into the car, my breath now visible in the suddenly chilly air. The emergency phone in my pocket felt heavy as I debated calling it in. Who would believe this? They'd think I was drunk or playing a prank. As I moved deeper into the car, the lights began to flicker more intensely, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of any source. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. There were no reflections in the windows, not even my own. A low vibration started beneath my feet, different from the usual subway rumblings I'd grown accustomed to. It was more like a pulse, organic and irregular, as if something vast was stirring deep within the tunnels. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and I could see frost beginning to form on the metal poles and handrails. Years of working these tunnels had taught me to trust my instincts, and every one of them was screaming at me to get out. But as I turned to leave, the door I'd entered through slammed shut with a decisive clang. The lights gave one final violent flicker before plunging the car into total darkness, leaving me alone with nothing but the sound of that strange pulsing, and what I could have sworn was the soft creak of seats slowly turning to face my position. The darkness lasted only moments before the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the car in a sickly red glow in that crimson illumination. I noticed something that had escaped my attention before. Faint marks on the floor, like scratches leading toward the next car. They looked old, yet somehow I was certain they hadn't been there during my earlier inspection. My hand shook slightly as I pulled out my master key, forcing myself to follow standard procedures despite the surreal situation. The connecting door between cars whispered open with a hiss that sounded almost like a sigh. The next car appeared normal at first glance, but as I swept my flashlight across the interior, I noticed strange symbols etched into the metal walls. They looked ancient, yet the metal around them showed no signs of age or wear. As I moved closer to examine them, my radio crackled to life, spitting out bursts of static interspersed with what sounded like backward speech. Something about those symbols tugged at my memory. Back in '78, before my time, there had been a series of mysterious incidents on the old South Ferry Loop. 3 entire trains had gone missing, passengers and all, only to reappear days later with everyone aboard suffering from acute memory loss. The case had been quietly buried, but I remembered seeing similar markings in the old incident photos during my training. The temperature continued to drop, and my breath came out in thick white clouds. The pulsing beneath my feet grew stronger, and now I could feel it in my chest like a massive heartbeat echoing through the tunnel system. The emergency lights began to strobe, and in the intervals between flashes, I caught glimpses of something moving in the shadows. Something that shouldn't have been able to fit in the confined space of a subway car. A distant screeching sound echoed through the tunnel, metal on metal but distorted and wrong. It was similar to the sound of a train's brakes, but stretched and warped until it became almost organic. The noise grew closer, and with it came a presence, a weight in the air that pressed against my skin like a physical force. The symbols on the walls began to pulse with a faint, phosphorescent light. My radio crackled again, but this time, instead of static, I heard a voice I recognized, my own. "Sullivan," it said, in a tone I'd never used. "Welcome back. We've been waiting since 1978. The impossible voice was followed by the sound of footsteps on the roof of the car, moving steadily toward my position through the warped window glass. I caught my first glimpse of where the train had taken me. We weren't on any line I recognized. The tunnel walls were older, made of fitted stone rather than concrete, and covered in more of those pulsing symbols. The track ahead disappeared into a cavernous station that had never appeared on any transit map I'd seen in my 2 decades of service. Something compelled me to check my phone's camera roll. Among my recent photos, I found images I hadn't taken, black and white photographs from what appeared to be the 1970s. They showed groups of passengers seated in subway cars, their faces blurred and distorted, all turned to face the center of the car. The final photo showed a younger version of myself, wearing my current uniform, standing among them. The timestamp read, June 15th, 1978, the day of the first disappearance, The walls of the car began to sweat a thick black liquid that moved against gravity, flowing upward toward the ceiling. The substance formed patterns that matched the symbols on the walls, creating a complex network of flowing channels above my head. Each droplet that fell sizzled when it hit the floor, leaving tiny holes in the metal like acid burns. My flashlight beam caught movement at the far end of the car, a figure standing in the shadows. It wore an old transit authority uniform, identical to mine but decades out of date. As it stepped forward, I realized with horror that it was translucent, and through its form I could see more figures moving in the tunnel beyond, all wearing uniforms from different eras. The radio at my hip sparked to life again, but instead of voices, it emitted a series of coordinated tones that matched the pulsing of the symbols. The black liquid on the ceiling began to drip faster, forming puddles that didn't spread but instead began to take shape, rising up like oil sculptures that vaguely resembled human forms. A distant rumbling grew steadily louder, not from the tracks below but from somewhere above. The ceiling panels began to bend inward, as if something massive was pressing down from above. Through the distorted metal, I could make out what looked like enormous fingers, each one larger than the car itself, trying to peel open the roof like a tin can. The massive fingers retreated, but their impression remained in the twisted metal of the ceiling. The black liquid had formed a perfect mirror on the floor, reflecting not the interior of the car, but what appeared to be the same station from 1978. In that reflection, the car was full of passengers, all seated and staring forward with blank expressions, their features slowly melting like wax figures in intense heat. My uniform felt heavier, and when I looked down I realized it was changing, the fabric aging decades in seconds. The name tag morphed, showing different names and dates, cycling through generations of transit workers who had come before me. Each name triggered a flood of memories that weren't mine. Countless nights spent in these tunnels, witnessing things that defied explanation. The ghost-like figure in the vintage uniform stepped closer, and I recognized him as James Chen, the transit worker who had first reported the 1978 disappearances. His form flickered like a bad television signal, and when he spoke, his voice came from my radio rather than his mouth. "They're not gone, Sullivan. They were never gone. They're just waiting, trapped between stations, between times." The black mirror on the floor began to ripple, and hands reached up through its surface. Dozens of them, wearing watches and jewelry frozen in the styles of the late 1970s, they grabbed at my ankles, their touch burning cold through my boots. The memories intensified. I was there in 78 and 85 and 92, every major incident in the system's history, watching as something ancient slowly worked its way up through the layers of the city's bedrock. A high-pitched whine filled the air, and the windows of the car showed impossible views. All the paths that could have been, every possible version of this night throughout time. In some, I had already become like the others, seated and staring, waiting for the next victim. In others, I saw what would happen if that thing beneath the city finally broke through. The skyscrapers above twisting into new configurations that denied physics and sanity. Through the cacophony of overlapping realities, I began to understand. The subway system wasn't just a network of tunnels. It was a cage, built by people who knew what slept beneath Manhattan. The symbols weren't warnings. They were bars in that cage, and something had been systematically weakening them, using the trains as a means to reach out, pulling in those who noticed to add to its collection. The realization hit me with the force of a speeding train. I wasn't just discovering this pattern, I was part of it, had always been part of it. The memories weren't false. They were mine, accumulated across multiple iterations of this same night. Each time adding another layer to the entity's power, every disappeared passenger, every missing worker, had been absorbing into its consciousness, their experiences becoming part of its growing awareness. The black liquid mirror shattered, sending shards of reflected time skittering across the floor. Each fragment showed a different moment. The first subway groundbreaking in 1904, workers discovering strange bones and artifacts that were quickly hushed up. The real reason certain stations had been abandoned. The true purpose of the numbered and lettered lines forming elaborate sigils across Manhattan's bedrock. James Chen's ghost began to change, his form elongating and distorting until he no longer looked human. "You understand now." The thing that wasn't Chen said, its voice resonating through every piece of metal in the car. "The trains don't just move through space, they move through time, through possibilities. And now you've finally found the right combination, the right moment. You're the key we've been waiting for." The symbols on the walls flared blindingly bright, and I felt reality begin to tear. Through the rips, I saw them. Massive shapes that hurt my mind to look at, pressing against the fabric of our world like fingers testing a membrane. The entity hadn't been trying to break out. It had been trying to break through, using the electromagnetic fields of the subway system to weaken the barriers between dimensions. My radio exploded in a shower of sparks, and in that burst of light, I saw my reflection in the window. But it wasn't me anymore. I saw every version of myself from every cycle of this night, our faces overlapping and merging. We had all made the same choice, over and over, adding our consciousness to the collective, strengthening it. But this time was different. This time I could see the pattern, the thing that had been Chen lunged forward, its form now a writhing mass of angles that shouldn't exist. But I was ready. I pulled out my old service revolver, the one I'd found in my locker at the start of my shift, though I'd never owned one, and aimed it at the central control panel. The bullet shattered the metal plate, revealing the ancient symbol carved into the subway car's frame. The one that had been hidden there since 1904, waiting for this exact moment. As reality collapsed around me, I smiled. Sometimes the only way to break a cycle is to destroy the track it runs on. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I adjusted my camera strap, watching the morning fog dance between the towering pines of the Colorado Trail. I'd driven 3 hours from Denver to capture the infamous golden hour in this secluded part of the wilderness. As a freelance photographer, I'd learned that sometimes the best shots required complete solitude, even if that meant ignoring the cautionary tales about hiking alone. The trail ahead twisted through dense forest, promising the kind of raw, untouched beauty I'd been searching for in my work. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more the silence seemed to press against my ears. There was something off about it. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the soft crunch of my boots against the fallen pine needles. I'd been on countless solo hikes before, but something about this trail felt different. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers above my head. I shook off the feeling, blaming it on too many horror movies and my overactive imagination. I stopped to check my GPS, marking the coordinates of a particularly stunning viewpoint, when something caught my eye. Half buried in a bed of moss, its black body almost invisible against the dark earth, lay an old Nikon camera. Not just any digital model, but a genuine F3 from the late 80s or early 90s. My heart skipped a beat. These were legendary among photographers, known for their virtually indestructible build and stunning image quality. As I picked it up, brushing away decades of debris, I noticed it was still in remarkable condition, almost as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. The weight of it felt reassuring in my hands. Professional-grade equipment from an era when things were built to last. Out of habit, I checked the film compartment, surprised to find a roll inside. Even more surprising was that it appeared to be unexposed. The film leader still visible, my mind raced with possibilities. Who would leave such a valuable camera out here? And with unused film, the serial number had been scratched off, adding another layer of mystery to my find. The rational part of my brain suggested turning it into the ranger station. But my curiosity as a photographer won out. I had a darkroom set up at home. A rarity these days, but essential for my vintage photography side projects. The possibility of developing whatever mysteries this film might hold was too tempting to resist. I carefully tucked the camera into my backpack, making a mental note of the exact location in case I needed to return it later. As I continued along the trail, the woods seemed to close in around me. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the fog thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead. I pulled out my phone to check the weather radar, but there was no signal. Not unusual for these remote trails, but unsettling nonetheless. An overwhelming urge to look behind me kept creeping up, like someone was watching my every move. Yet each time I turned, there was nothing but the endless sea of pines, their shadows growing longer as the afternoon wore on. It wasn't until I made it back to my car that I noticed something strange. My own camera's memory card was completely empty. Despite having taken dozens of shots throughout the day, the familiar red glow of my darkroom offered little comfort as I prepared to develop the mysterious film. I'd done this hundreds of times before, but my hands trembled slightly as I mixed the chemicals. The anticipation was almost unbearable. After 20 years in photography, I'd developed a sixth sense about these things. Something about this roll felt different, important somehow. The scratched-off serial number kept nagging at my thoughts. Along with the strange emptiness of my own camera's memory card, the process was automatic after so many years. Developer, stop bath, fixer. As the images began to appear on the paper, my heart stopped. The first photo showed the exact trail I'd been hiking that morning. Nothing unusual except for the timestamp in the corner. 10:47 a.m., the exact time I'd been there. But that was impossible. The camera had been abandoned, covered in years of forest debris. The next image made my blood run cold. There I was, adjusting my own camera strap, taken from behind a cluster of trees where no photographer could have stood without me noticing. My hands shook as I hung up print after print, each one more impossible than the last. Every photo was from that day, showing me from different angles that would have required the photographer to be floating in midair or standing in plain sight. In one particularly disturbing shot, I was looking directly at where the photographer must have been standing. But in the image, my expression was vacant, unaware, as if the photographer was invisible. The timestamps progressed chronologically through my entire hike, including moments I distinctly remembered being completely alone. The final photograph in the sequence made me stumble backward, knocking over my developing trays with a crash. It showed me in my darkroom right now, hanging up the previous photographs. The timestamp read the current time down to the minute. I spun around, heart pounding, but the darkroom was empty save for the red safe light's glow. The chemical smell suddenly seemed overwhelming, suffocating. I grabbed the photos and burst out of the darkroom, gasping for air, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. In my living room, under normal light, the photos looked even more impossible. The quality was incredible, almost three-dimensional, with a clarity that seemed to pierce right through the paper. But there was something else. Something I hadn't noticed in the darkroom's red light. In each image, barely visible in the background, was a dark figure. It seemed to get closer in each subsequent photo, its form becoming more distinct. In the final darkroom shot, it stood directly behind me, its features still frustratingly obscured by shadow. Sleep was impossible that night. I pored over the photos again and again, trying to find some logical explanation. The camera itself sat on my coffee table, its lens reflecting the dim lamplight like a watching eye. Several times I caught myself staring at it, half expecting it to move on its own. Around 3 in the morning, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The film counter hadn't moved. According to the camera, the roll was still full, unexposed. Despite the photos spread out before me, morning found me hunched over my laptop, empty coffee cups scattered around as I dug through photography forums and local history sites. The Nikon F3's serial number being scratched off bothered me. Someone had deliberately tried to make this camera untraceable. My research led me to a local news archive from 1992, and what I found made my throat tighten. A series of disappearances had plagued these trails 30 years ago. All photographers, all their gear found abandoned except for their cameras. The cases were never solved. The article mentioned a local man, James Carter, who'd owned a camera shop in Boulder. During that period, he was questioned but never charged, and the shop had burned down mysteriously shortly after the last disappearance. What caught my attention was the photo accompanying the article. There, sitting on Carter's shop counter, was a Nikon F3 that looked identical to the one now sitting on my desk. I tried enlarging the image to check the serial number, but it was too grainy to make out. My phone rang, making me jump, making me... It was the local ranger station responding to my inquiry about lost property. The ranger's voice was strange, hesitant. When I described the camera, she asked me to hold, and when she returned, her tone had changed completely. She insisted I bring the camera in immediately, becoming almost frantic when I mentioned developing the film. Before I could ask why, the line went dead. When I tried calling back, a recorded message said the station was closed. At 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, I decided to drive to Carter's old shop address, now a vacant lot overgrown with weeds. As I approached, I noticed something odd. My car's digital display was glitching, the numbers cycling randomly. My phone was acting up too, the screen flickering between photos I'd never taken, all showing the empty lot from different angles. Standing there, I felt a strange pull, like the place recognized me. A glint of metal caught my eye from beneath the weeds. An old door handle, apparently leading to a basement that had survived the fire. Using my phone's flashlight, I descended the crumbling stairs into the darkness. The beam caught something that made my heart race. Hundreds of photographs covering the walls, all showing the same trails where I'd found the camera. But these photos were different, wrong somehow. The people in them seemed to fade into the background, becoming transparent, while dark figures similar to the one in my photos grew more solid. In the center of the room stood an old dark room door, its red light still glowing after all these years. Inside, the dark room was immaculate, as if it had been used yesterday. Development trays were laid out, filled with clear liquid that seemed to move on its own. Hanging on the drying lines were photos that couldn't possibly exist. They showed me, standing in this very room, right now, looking at these same photos, but in each progressive shot. My image became fainter, while another figure, the one from my photos, became clearer. With horror, I realized I was looking at photos of my own future, showing my gradual disappearance. Frame by frame, the photos on the wall began to make terrible sense. Each series showed the same pattern: a hiker finding the camera, their gradual fading from existence as the dark figure took their place. The timestamps spanned decades, but the process was always the same. The camera wasn't just taking pictures, it was somehow transferring life force, replacing the photographer with something else. The final photo in each series showed the same scene: the camera being left on the trail, waiting for its next victim. A leather-bound journal lay open on the development counter, its pages filled with Carter's increasingly manic handwriting. He wrote about discovering an ancient ritual that could trap souls through photography, using the camera as a conduit. The process required specific conditions: a solitary subject, a sacred location, and 13 exposures taken in sequence. Carter had modified the Nikon F3 to create an infinite loop, each roll of film perpetually unexposed, yet somehow containing the images of its previous victims. The journal's final entry was dated the day of the fire. Carter had realized he couldn't control what was coming through the camera anymore. The entity he'd summoned was growing stronger with each soul it consumed, starting to take photos on its own. The fire wasn't an accident. It was his last desperate attempt to destroy what he'd created, but he'd failed. The camera had survived, protected by whatever dark force now possessed it, waiting in the woods for someone like me to find it. A noise behind me made me spin around. The development trays were bubbling, the liquid now black as ink. In their reflection, I could see the dark figure from the photos, standing right behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing there. The room's red light began to pulse, and the photos on the drying line started to move, like frames in a film, showing my current movements seconds before I made them. I was no longer just viewing these photos, I was becoming part of them. My phone's camera app opened by itself, the screen showing the dark room from impossible angles. With each new angle, I could see the dark figure more clearly in the background. No longer just a shadow, but something almost human-shaped, wearing what looked like an ancient photographer's hood. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like someone learning to manipulate a human body for the first time. In the phone screen, I watched in horror as it reached out toward my reflection. Suddenly, all the photos on the walls began to drift toward me, defying gravity. Each one showed a different victim at the moment they realized their fate, their expressions frozen in terror as they faded away. The photos swirled faster and faster, creating a vortex of trapped souls, all centered on the Nikon F3 that had somehow appeared on the counter in front of me. Through my phone screen, I could see my own image starting to fade, becoming transparent like all the others. While the hooded figure grew more solid with each passing second, the realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. The camera wasn't just a tool, it was a gateway, and every photograph was a window through which this entity could reach our world. But windows work both ways, and as a photographer, I understood something Carter hadn't: the power of the observer to change what's being observed. I raised my phone, no longer trying to escape what was happening but leaning into it, embracing my role not as victim but as fellow artist. The hooded figure hesitated, sensing the shift in my approach. I began taking photos deliberately, matching its rhythm, creating a feedback loop between my phone and the Nikon F3. The darkroom lights flickered wildly as reality itself seemed to bend around us. Each photo I took pulled the entity further into our world, but also gave me a deeper understanding of its nature. It wasn't just consuming souls, it was collecting moments, trying to piece together an existence from fragments of stolen lives. The photos swirling around us began to change, showing not just the victims' final moments, but their entire lives. Every photograph they'd ever taken or appeared in. I understood then what I had to do. I pointed my phone at the Nikon F3 and pressed record. Creating a bridge between digital and analog, present and past, the camera began to vibrate, its metal body humming with otherworldly energy. The being was trapped between worlds, unable to fully manifest while caught in this loop of infinite observation. Light poured from both cameras, and the photographs on the walls burst into flames, releasing decades of trapped souls. Each liberation weakened the entity's hold on our world. The hooded figure lurched toward me, its form fluctuating between solid and transparent, but I held my ground, continuing to record. The basement filled with the sound of thousands of camera shutters firing at once, a deafening cacophony of mechanical clicks that built to a crescendo. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Through my phone's screen, I watched the hooded figure's true form finally revealed. Not some ancient evil, but Carter himself, transformed by his own ritual into the very thing he'd tried to capture. The photos showed his descent into madness, his obsession with immortality through imagery, leading him to trap himself in an endless loop of his own creation. Now, faced with a photographer who understood the true power of images, his carefully constructed prison was collapsing in the final moments. As the basement began to cave in around us, I did the one thing none of his victims had thought to do. I turned both cameras toward him and pressed their shutters simultaneously. The resulting feedback loop of images tore a hole in whatever dimensional barrier he'd been hiding behind. Carter's twisted form was pulled into the vortex of his own making, his screams lost in the sound of one last, thunderous shutter click. As silence fell, I found myself standing in the empty lot above, the sun setting behind the mountains. Both cameras were gone, but my phone contained a single image, a photo of an empty Nikon F3 lying in the woods, its lens shattered, waiting to be reclaimed by the earth. I never thought my life would change because of a book return. Working as head librarian at the Northwoods Public Library in small-town Wisconsin had always been predictably peaceful, until that bitter January morning. The metallic clang of the return box still echoes in my mind, the sound that marked the beginning of my descent into madness. I remember checking the box, as I did every morning at precisely 8 a.m., my breath visible in the frigid air. Among the usual worn paperbacks and children's books was a leather-bound volume I'd never seen before. The book had no barcode, no library stamp, nothing to indicate it belonged to our collection or any other library. Its midnight black cover was unmarked, except for a strange symbol embossed in faded silver, something that looked like a twisted tree with too many branches. The pages were yellowed but crisp, and the text appeared to be handwritten in an elegant, old-fashioned script. As I opened it, the musty scent of age and decay filled my nostrils. making me slightly nauseous. I should have known something was wrong when I noticed the way the ink seemed to shift slightly under the fluorescent lights of my office. The story within told of a woman who discovered ancient markings carved into trees deep in the northern Highland American Legion State Forest. She followed the markers deeper and deeper into the woods, driven by an inexplicable compulsion. The account was so vivid, so detailed, that I could almost feel the crunch of dead leaves beneath my feet as I read. That first day, I couldn't put the book down. My assistant, Mike, had to remind me twice about the children's story hour. The narrative had its hooks in me, describing how the protagonist found a clearing with a perfect circle of ancient pines, their bark blackened as if by fire. In the center stood a stone altar, so old that it was nearly reclaimed by the earth. The story ended abruptly mid-sentence as the woman reached out to touch the altar's surface. Later that night, as I was updating our database, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. A quick search revealed that a woman named Rebecca Hayes had gone missing in those same woods 20 years ago. The details of her disappearance matched the story's description perfectly, right down to the red wool coat she was wearing. I told myself it was just a coincidence, but deep down I knew better. The next morning, 2 more books appeared in the return box. They were identical to the first, but their stories, while starting the same way, ended differently. In one, the woman was found weeks later, her body twisted into impossible angles. In the other, she was never found, but her journal was discovered, its final pages filled with frantic drawings of eyes watching from between the trees. That's when I realized these books weren't just telling stories. They were warnings, and someone, or something, wanted me to read them all. The library's security cameras showed nothing. Each morning, the books simply appeared, as if materialized from thin air. By the end of the week, I had 7 volumes, each more disturbing than the last. They all began with the same woman, in the same woods, but their endings spawned into a twisted tree of possibilities, each branch a new horror. I started keeping a journal, mapping out the connections between the stories, looking for patterns in the chaos. What disturbed me most wasn't the gruesome endings, it was the details. Each book contained information that couldn't possibly be public knowledge. The exact shade of Rebecca Hayes' nail polish the day she disappeared. The contents of her last voicemail to her sister, the strange symbol she'd drawn repeatedly in her private diary. I knew because I'd started researching her case obsessively, spending my evenings at the local newspaper archives. The breakthrough came when I noticed a name repeated in 3 of the books. David Chen. He was mentioned only in passing, a forest ranger who'd been one of the last people to see Rebecca alive. When I dug deeper, I discovered he'd been involved in 5 other missing persons cases over the past 2 decades. All disappearances had occurred within the same 5-mile radius of the forest. All the victims had been found in different states of horror, or not found at all. I couldn't ignore the coincidences anymore. The books were telling me something, leading me somewhere. Each story was like a puzzle piece, and together they formed a pattern I was only beginning to understand. The symbol on the covers, I found it carved into trees in old photographs from missing persons cases dating back to the 1970s. The same twisted tree, always pointing deeper into the forest. My research revealed a pattern of disappearances every 7 years, like clockwork, and according to my calculations, we were due for another one. The dates aligned perfectly with the lunar cycle and the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain. It couldn't be coincidence that the books started appearing exactly 49 days before the next expected disappearance. I made the mistake of sharing my findings with Mike. He was concerned, said I wasn't sleeping enough, that I was becoming obsessed. But how could I sleep when every time I closed my eyes, I saw those twisted tree symbols when I knew that somewhere out there, something was waiting, counting down the days until its next victim. The books kept coming, and with each new volume, I felt myself being pulled deeper into a mystery that threatened to consume me entirely. The forest called to me long before I stepped into its shadows. I knew it was foolish to go alone, but the books had made it clear. This was my path to walk. I took a leave of absence from the library, packed my backpack with supplies, and left a detailed letter with my sister explaining everything. If I didn't return, at least someone would know where to look. The morning air was crisp with early frost as I parked my car at the ranger station. The symbols were easier to find than I expected, almost as if they were waiting for me. Each twisted tree marking led to another, drawing me deeper into the ancient forest. The centuries-old pines towered above, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. The further I walked, the more the forest seemed to change. The familiar Wisconsin wilderness transformed into something older, something that didn't belong in this century. The air grew thick, with an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. I discovered the first real evidence that I wasn't chasing shadows when I found Rebecca Hayes's pendant, half buried in the soil. It matched the description from one of the books perfectly. A silver crescent moon on a broken chain. The metal was tarnished but unmistakable near it, partially hidden under years of fallen leaves, was a camera. The film was still inside, preserved by some miracle of fate or perhaps something more sinister. As the day progressed, the forest grew denser, more primordial. The trees seemed to twist in impossible ways, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I started finding more items. A torn red wool mitten from another victim, a rusty watch that had belonged to a missing hiker, all exactly where the books had described them. Each discovery confirmed what I had feared. The stories weren't fiction, they were possibilities, variations of a truth too terrible to exist in a single version. The temperature dropped dramatically as I approached what I believed was the center of the pattern I'd mapped out. The air took on a greenish tinge, and my compass began spinning wildly. I heard whispers in the wind, fragments of conversations from the stories I'd read, echoing through the trees. The voices seemed to be calling my name, each one a different victim, each one leading me towards something I couldn't yet see. Then I found it, the clearing from the first book. The circle of blackened pines stood exactly as described, their bark scarred with hundreds of the twisted tree symbols. In the center, partially obscured by creeping vines, was the stone altar. But there was something the books hadn't mentioned. The altar was covered in fresh carvings, and they were still being made. As I watched, invisible tools etched new symbols into the stone surface. They were writing my name. The altar's surface was warm to the touch despite the freezing air as my fingers traced the fresh carvings. Visions flooded my mind. Glimpses of all the victims whose stories I'd read in those mysterious books. They weren't just stories. They were attempts to warn me, to show me the full scope of what I was facing. The entity that dwelled here didn't just take people, it collected their narratives, their possible fates, and bound them into those leather volumes. I understood then why Ranger Chen had been present at so many disappearances. He wasn't just a witness, he was a guardian, trying to prevent people from stumbling upon this place. The books I'd found were his attempts to document what happened here. But something had corrupted his records, turning them into something else entirely. In one of the visions, I saw him making the final entries in each book, his hands shaking as something dark loomed over his shoulder. The truth about the forest entity emerged in fragments of horror. It was ancient, predating the first human settlements in the area. The Native Americans had known about it. I saw their warnings carved into the trees, markers meant to keep people away from its hunting grounds. But as civilization encroached and their warnings were forgotten, the entity adapted. It began collecting stories, using them to lure new victims, each one adding to its library of possible endings. The air around the altar began to shimmer, and I saw them, transparent figures moving between the trees. Every victim whose story I'd read was there, trapped in an eternal loop of their final moments. Rebecca Hayes reached out to touch the altar again and again. Others ran screaming into the darkness, only to reappear and repeat their futile escape attempts. The entity fed on their fear, their desperation, their multitude of possible fates. Among the shadows, I spotted Ranger Chen, unlike the others. He was solid, real. He'd been here all along, neither dead nor alive, forced to serve as the entity's librarian. His eyes met mine with a mix of sorrow and warning. He'd been the one sending the books, trying to prepare me for what I would find. But there was something else in his gaze, a desperate hope. After decades of watching helplessly, he'd found someone who could understand the pattern, Who might be able to break it? The entity had rules, weaknesses hidden in the variations of its victims' stories. Each book was a piece of a larger puzzle, and together they formed a map, not just of the forest, but of the entity's very nature. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the twisted trees, I realized why I had been chosen. As a librarian, I had the skills to catalogue, to cross-reference, to find the pattern within the chaos. The entity had made a crucial mistake in choosing me as its next victim. It had given me the very tools I needed to destroy it. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The books weren't just records or warnings. They were fragments of the entity's power. Each volume contained a piece of its essence, bound in leather and ink. The ritual that trapped it here centuries ago had split its consciousness across multiple narratives, and in doing so, created its weakness. I began pulling the books from my backpack, arranging them around the altar in a pattern that mirrored the twisted tree symbol. As twilight deepened into night, the air grew thick with a palpable malevolence. The phantom victims faded away one by one, leaving only Ranger Chen and me in the clearing. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his haunted eyes. For decades, he had been adding to the entity's power without realizing it, creating new books, new variations of each victim's fate. But now, with every book placed in the pattern, I was reconstructing the original binding ritual. The entity realized what was happening too late. The ground began to tremble, and the twisted trees groaned like living things in pain. Dark tendrils of energy writhed between the books, trying to pull them back, to scatter them before the pattern could be completed. The air filled with whispers, offering me every possible happy ending to my own story. Wealth, fame, love, everything I'd ever dreamed of. When the temptations failed, it showed me visions of my own terrible fates, each more horrifying than the last. Ranger Chen moved to help me, fighting against the force that had enslaved him for so long. Together we placed the final book, completing the pattern. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The books began to glow with an inner light, their pages fluttering in a wind that didn't exist. The entity's screams echoed through the forest in every voice it had ever stolen, a chorus of terror and rage that made my ears bleed and my vision blur. The altar cracked, a deep fissure splitting it from top to bottom as it broke. Something ancient and dark began to pull free from the earth beneath it, but the pattern of books held it in place, forcing it back down. The twisted tree symbols on the surrounding pines began to burn with a silver fire, creating a cage of light that grew smaller and smaller. Compressing the entity's power back into a single point, Ranger Chen's form began to fade as the entity's hold on him weakened. In the end, it came down to a single choice. My own story's ending, the entity offered me one final bargain: walk away, leave the books, and live. But I had read too many endings to believe in its promises. With the last of my strength, I pushed the broken halves of the altar together, trapping the entity between them. The books burst into flames, their pages turning to ash that swirled in a vortex around the clearing as consciousness faded. I saw Ranger Chen smile for the first time in decades before he dissolved into mist. Finally free, the forest was silent once more, but this time it was the silence of peace, not of waiting terror. I had written the final chapter, and this time the ending was mine to choose. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly above my head as I made my way through level B3 of the Pioneer Square parking garage, 14 years of working security, and this place still gave me the creeps after midnight. My footsteps echoed through the concrete maze, bouncing off walls covered in decades of exhaust stains. The night shift had become a familiar routine. Check the cameras, walk the levels, report anything suspicious, but tonight felt different. Heavier somehow, like the air itself was holding its breath. I remember the first time I noticed the black 67 Impala. It sat in spot B345, its pristine chrome gleaming under the harsh lights despite the thick layer of dust coating its surface. No one parks classic cars in places like this, especially not in downtown Seattle where car theft is as common as rain. I made a note in my log and continued my rounds. 3 hours later, passing through B2, my flashlight beam caught those same chrome bumpers. Now in spot B228, I froze, checking my notes again. Same plate number, same dust pattern on the hood, but a completely different location. The security cameras should have caught someone moving it, but when I reviewed the footage, there was nothing, just empty frames of concrete and fluorescent light. And then suddenly, there it was, like it had materialized from thin air. I ran the plates through our system. No registered owner, no parking permit, nothing. Just a ghost car playing some sick game of musical chairs in my garage. My palms were sweating as I printed the still frames, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That first week, I tracked its movements obsessively. B3 to B2, B2 to B1, then back to B3. Never catching it in motion, never seeing a driver. I started taking different routes during my rounds, doubling back, watching from the cameras. Nothing, just an empty car that refused to stay put. The other guards thought I was losing it, making jokes about my haunted hot rod. But they hadn't seen what I had seen. The way condensation formed on the inside of the windows, like someone was breathing in there. It was during my break when I first noticed the scratches, deep gouges in the concrete floor, leading to and from each spot where the Impala had been parked. They looked fresh, like something had dragged heavy metal chains across the surface. Following them with my flashlight, I discovered they formed patterns, not random marks, but deliberate shapes that made my skin crawl. That's when I knew I wasn't just dealing with a simple case of parking lot vandalism. The breaking point came when I found the old newspaper clippings in the garage office archives. 3 disappearances, spread across 4 decades, all from this same parking structure. Each time, witnesses reported seeing a black Chevrolet Impala, 67 model, parked near where the victims were last seen. The most recent was just 6 months ago. A young woman who'd vanished between levels B2 and B3. They never found her car, but her parking ticket was stamped at 11:47 p.m., the same time I'd been seeing the Impala make its mysterious moves. The police weren't interested in my theories about a supernatural vehicle stalking the garage. Detective Sarah Chen listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes as she flipped through my carefully documented log of the car's movements. "Mr. Thompson," she'd said, tapping her pen against the incident reports, "cars don't move by themselves." But she did leave me with an interesting piece of information. There had been similar reports from other parking structures in the city. Dating back to the 1970s, I spent my off days in the public library. Digging through microfiche archives of old newspapers, the pattern emerged slowly but unmistakably. Every few years, the same description would appear in missing persons reports: a pristine 67 Impala, black as midnight, seen in the vicinity of various disappearances. The earliest mention I could find was from 1968. Barely a year after the model had rolled off the production line, a businessman had vanished from his office parking garage, leaving behind nothing but a set of keys and a strange series of scratches on the concrete. The security footage continued to taunt me. I'd spend hours reviewing the tapes, frame by frame, looking for any clue to how the car was moving. Sometimes, in the split second between frames, I could swear I saw something, a dark figure behind the wheel or movement in the back seat, but it was always gone when I tried to freeze the image, like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. The other guards started taking different shifts, avoiding me and my obsession with the Phantom Impala. Late one night, as I was cross-referencing dates of sightings with lunar cycles, I was trying everything at this point. I found something that made my blood run cold. Every disappearance had occurred exactly 40 days after the first reported sighting of the car in that location. I checked my logs with trembling hands. It had been 37 days since I first spotted the Impala in B345. Whatever was going to happen, I had less than 3 days to figure it out and stop it. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a retired mechanic named Frank Whitaker who'd worked at a Chevrolet dealership in the late 60s. He responded to one of the many forum posts I'd made, seeking information about black 67 Impalas with unusual histories. According to Frank, there was one particular vehicle that had always stood out in his memory, a custom order that had come with bizarre modifications to the chassis and engine compartment. The customer had insisted on specific occult symbols being etched into the engine block and had paid in cash with bills that Frank swore were dated from 1929. I had to force myself to stay calm as I read Frank's detailed email. He described the customer as tall and pale, wearing an outdated suit and speaking with an accent he couldn't place. The man had said something that had stuck with Frank all these years. Some vehicles are doors, Mr. Whitaker, and some doors should never be opened. After the car was delivered, 3 employees who had worked on it disappeared within the month. The dealership burned down shortly after, destroying all records of the sale. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't tracking a haunted car. I was watching a predator stalk its hunting ground. The Impala wasn't just moving between parking spaces. It was marking territory, creating some sort of ritual pattern with its seemingly random relocations. I spent hours mapping out every position where I'd seen it parked, connecting the dots on a garage blueprint. The resulting pattern was unmistakable, a massive sigil drawn across all 3 underground levels of the parking structure. Sleep became impossible as I dove deeper into the mystery. My apartment walls became a conspiracy board of string and photographs. Tracking the Impala's movements through decades of sightings, the pattern was always the same. 40 days of movement, followed by a disappearance. Sometimes it was months before the car would resurface in another location, but it never stayed dormant for long. What troubled me most were the gaps in the record. How many disappearances had gone unconnected to the phantom vehicle? The scratches on the concrete led me to consult an expert in ancient symbols, Dr. Elena Martinez at the university's archaeology department. Her face went pale when she saw my photographs. The patterns weren't random at all, but fragments of something much older than the car, older than the city itself. She told me about legends of spaces between spaces, doors that opened to places that shouldn't exist. The symbols were part of a containment ritual, she explained, meant to keep something locked away. But the ritual had been corrupted, turned into a summoning circle instead. On my next shift, I noticed something I'd somehow missed before, a subtle iridescent sheen to the Impala's black paint. Like oil on water, looking at it too long made my eyes hurt, as if the surface was shifting in ways that shouldn't be possible. The dust I'd noticed that first night wasn't dust at all, but a fine layer of crystalline material that seemed to absorb light when I finally worked up the courage to touch it. The substance was ice cold and left my fingertips numb for hours afterward. The security cameras began malfunctioning more frequently, especially when focused on the Impala. The digital timestamps would jump erratically, sometimes showing dates decades in the past or future. Late one night, I caught a glimpse of something that still haunts my dreams. For just a moment, the camera pointed at B228 showed the garage as it had looked in 1968, complete with period-appropriate vehicles and lighting. The Impala was there too, looking exactly the same as it did now, a temporal constant in a shifting landscape of time. The true horror of the situation became clear when I discovered the missing persons reports weren't telling the whole story. Some people had returned, days, weeks, or even years after their disappearances, but they came back wrong. Their minds shattered by whatever they'd experienced. Hospital records described patients who would only speak in backwards whispers, whose shadows fell in impossible directions, whose reflections moved independently of their bodies. They all shared one detail in their fractured testimony, a black car that was bigger on the inside than any vehicle should be. With less than 24 hours remaining in the 40-day cycle, I made a decision that would either save lives or condemn me to whatever fate had claimed the others. I armed myself with every tool I could think of: cameras, UV lights, electromagnetic field detectors borrowed from a paranormal investigation group, and a set of ancient protective symbols provided by Dr. Martinez. The night shift had never felt longer as I waited for my chance to confront whatever force was using the Impala as its doorway into our world. The garage was unnaturally quiet that night. The usual ambient sounds of the city above completely muted, as if the concrete walls had thickened into an impenetrable barrier between worlds. The fluorescent lights flickered more frequently than usual, creating strobing shadows that seemed to move independently of any visible source. The air felt thick and oily in my lungs, carrying a metallic taste that reminded me of old pennies, and watching the thermometer drop steadily, degree by degree, until I could see my breath hanging in clouds before my face. Around 3 a.m., the security cameras went completely dark, one by one, like a wave of darkness sweeping through the garage. My phone died next, followed by my flashlight, leaving me in near total darkness. The only illumination came from the emergency exit signs, their red glow seeming to pulse like dying heartbeats. That's when I heard it, the sound of an engine idling, but distorted somehow as if playing at the wrong speed. It echoed through the garage in impossible ways, sometimes seeming to come from all directions at once. I found the Impala in its original spot, B345, completing the ritual pattern I'd mapped out. The chrome trim rippled like liquid mercury, and the windows were completely black, not just tinted but filled with a darkness that seemed to swallow my emergency light's beam. The cold intensified as I approached, my protective charms growing heavy around my neck. The car's surface appeared to breathe, subtle expansions and contractions that might have been a trick of the light if I hadn't been watching so carefully. What happened next defied every law of physics and reason I thought I knew. The Impala's door opened by itself, but the interior I glimpsed wasn't the standard leather and chrome of a '67 Chevy. Instead, I saw a vast, dark space, like looking into an endless corridor lit by distant stars. The air that rushed out was ancient and stale, carrying whispers in languages that had never been meant for human tongues. My protective symbols began to burn cold against my skin, and I felt a pull, not physical but metaphysical, trying to draw me into that impossible space. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. The whispers grew louder, and in them I began to recognize voices, the missing people, dozens of them, calling out from whatever dimension the Impala had dragged them into. Among them, I heard something else, something older than humanity, speaking words that made my nose bleed and my vision blur. The thing wearing the shape of a car was finally revealing its true nature, and my sanity threatened to unravel at the sight of it. The protective symbols Dr. Martinez had given me flared with brilliant light, creating a barrier between me and the cosmic horror that lurked within the Impala's impossible interior. In that moment of clarity, I understood what I was facing. Not just a haunted car, but a trap designed to bridge the gap between dimensions, using human consciousness as fuel for something far more terrifying than any ghost or demon. The scratches on the concrete weren't just marks, they were anchor points, holding our reality together where this thing threatened to tear it apart. Time began to distort around me, moments stretching into eternities and then compressing back into seconds. I saw every disappearance that had ever occurred in this garage, playing out simultaneously. Dozens of people approaching the Impala across decades, drawn by whatever siren song it used to lure its prey. I saw their fates, twisted and transformed by exposure to whatever dwelled in that starlit void beyond the car's interior. The horror of it nearly broke me, but it also showed me what I needed to do. Using the last of my strength, I began destroying the ritual pattern, using a sledgehammer to break up the scratched sigils in the concrete. Each impact sent shockwaves of impossible colors through the air, and the whispers turned to screams of rage. The Impala's exterior began to lose cohesion, the metal flowing like wax as the thing inside fought to maintain its anchor in our dimension. The temperature plunged so low that frost formed on every surface, and reality itself seemed to buckle and warp around the vehicle. The entity made one final attempt to claim me, projecting visions of power and knowledge that nearly shattered my resolve. It showed me wonders and horrors beyond human comprehension, offered me answers to questions mankind had never dared to ask. But in those visions, I also saw the truth. This thing had been imprisoned for a reason, sealed away by forces that understood its true nature. The Impala wasn't just its hunting blind, it was the weakest point in its prison, and I had stumbled onto its feeding ground. With the last sigil broken, the laws of physics reasserted themselves with devastating force. The Impala imploded, collapsing in on itself like a miniature black hole. The screams reached a crescendo that shattered every light and window in the garage before cutting off abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. Where the car had been, only a perfect circle of scorched concrete remained, with a spiral pattern of cracks radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Dawn found me still sitting there watching the emergency lights slowly flicker back to life. The missing people were never recovered, and I know now they never will be. Whatever dimension that thing dragged them into, it exists beyond any hope of rescue. I submitted my resignation that morning, but I still drive by the garage sometimes, watching for any sign of a pristine black '67 Impala. The security cameras work normally now, and no more mysterious cars appear in different spots, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear those whispers, calling out from between the spaces where reality wears thin. And I wonder if I truly banished that thing back to its prison, or if it simply moved on to another hunting ground, wearing a different shape, waiting for someone else to notice the impossible car that never stays still. I've been delivering newspapers in Burlington, Vermont for the past 15 years, and I can tell you the exact location of every house on my route with my eyes closed. That's why when I first noticed something odd about 147 Maple Street that frosty October morning, every instinct in my body screamed that something was terribly wrong. The Victorian house with its weather-beaten grey siding and crooked shutters seemed normal enough, but I could have sworn it wasn't there yesterday. In fact, I was certain that old Mrs. Peterson's yellow cottage had occupied that spot for the past decade. My hands trembled as I checked my delivery log, thinking perhaps lack of sleep was finally catching up with me. The address was listed plain as day, 147 Maple Street, daily delivery, but that couldn't be right. I'd never delivered to this address before, yet here it was, looking as if it had stood there for 100 years. The peeling paint, overgrown bushes, and rust-stained windowsills told a story of decades of neglect. A crow perched on the crooked weather vane cawed mockingly as I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The longer I stared at the house, the more details seemed to shift and change. The front door, which I initially thought was painted black, now appeared to be a deep burgundy in the early morning light. The windows on the second floor seemed to have moved slightly closer together than they were just moments ago. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the subtle changes continued, like watching a time-lapse photograph in slow motion. I'd been working this route since I was 28 years old. Now, at 43, I prided myself on knowing every crack in every sidewalk. My supervisor, Tom, always joked that I could do my route blindfolded, but this house, this impossible house, was making me question everything I thought I knew about my little corner of Burlington. I pulled out my phone and took a quick picture, needing some kind of proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The morning air grew colder as I stood there, and a strange heaviness settled in my chest. Something about the house seemed to pull at me. Like a magnet, drawing iron filings, the front porch steps creaked, though there wasn't enough wind to move them. I could have sworn I saw a shadow pass behind one of the upstairs windows, but the house was clearly abandoned. The realtor's sign in the front yard was so faded that the phone number was illegible. The wood rotted around its base, despite every rational thought screaming at me to leave. I found myself walking up the cracked concrete path toward the front door. The newspaper in my hand felt inexplicably heavy, as if it were made of lead instead of paper. Just as I reached the bottom of the porch steps, a car alarm blared somewhere down the street, shattering the morning silence. I jumped, dropping the paper, and in that moment of distraction, I could have sworn I saw the entire house flicker, like a television with bad reception. By the time I looked up again, everything was still. But I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to find out what was happening at 147 Maple Street. The next morning, I arrived at my usual starting point 15 minutes early, my heart pounding with anticipation. The strange house had haunted my dreams all night, its windows becoming eyes that watched me as I slept. But when I turned onto Maple Street, my blood ran cold. The house wasn't at 147 anymore. It was now standing proudly at 223. Replacing the Andersons' newly renovated colonial, I pulled my delivery truck over and grabbed my phone, frantically pulling up yesterday's photo. The image was there showing the house at 147, but when I looked up, that address once again held Mrs. Peterson's yellow cottage. I spent my entire lunch break at the Burlington Historical Society, digging through dusty records and faded photographs. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, seemed unusually interested in my inquiry about the moving house. Her hands shook slightly as she helped me search through the archives, and I noticed how she avoided looking at the old photographs for too long. Finally, in a leather-bound volume from 1879, I found something. A series of articles about a house belonging to the Blackwood family, known for hosting mysterious gatherings and practicing what the papers delicately referred to as dimensional arts. The more I read, the more my chest tightened with a mixture of fear and fascination. The Blackwoods had disappeared one night in 1880, along with their entire house. The newspaper article described how neighbors had awakened to find nothing but an empty lot where the imposing Victorian had stood just hours before. Some claimed to have heard chanting the night before, while others reported seeing strange lights and geometric shapes floating in the air around the property. The case had never been solved, and the house had never been found. Until now, through the archive's glass windows, I could see the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows across the reading room. Margaret approached my table with another stack of documents, her face pale in the fading light. I was hoping no one would ever ask about that house again, she whispered, her voice trembling. My grandmother used to tell stories about the Blackwoods and their experiments with something they called spatial displacement. They believed they could fold space like paper, moving their house through dimensions we couldn't comprehend. The documents she brought contained personal letters from Elizabeth Blackwood, the family matriarch. The pages were filled with intricate diagrams and mathematical formulas that made my head spin, but it was the last entry that made my hands shake. We have finally succeeded in breaking free from the bonds of fixed space. Our home now exists in all places and no place simultaneously. But something has followed us through the fold, something that should have remained in the spaces between dimensions. As I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every house I passed seemed to leer at me, their windows like hungry mouths in the twilight. When I finally reached my apartment, I found a strange envelope waiting in my mailbox. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed with age, showing the Blackwood house in its original location. But what made my blood freeze was the figure standing in the upper window, a man in modern clothes, holding what appeared to be a bundle of newspapers. His face turned away from the camera. I couldn't sleep that night, the photograph from my mailbox burning a hole in my mind. When morning came, I called in sick for the first time in 15 years. Instead of my route, I drove to the address I'd found in the Historical Society's records for Dr. Marcus Chen, a theoretical physicist turned paranormal researcher who'd been studying Burlington's architectural anomalies for the past decade. His office was in a converted Victorian house, not unlike the Blackwood residence. And as I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that the buildings along the street were watching my every move. Dr. Chen was nothing like I expected. A young man with bright eyes and nervous energy who practically jumped out of his chair when I mentioned the moving house. "You've seen it?" he asked, spreading dozens of photographs across his desk. Each one showed the same Victorian house in different locations around Burlington, spanning decades, but the truly terrifying detail was that in each photo, the house appeared exactly the same, down to the broken shutter on the third floor and the pattern of moss on the foundation. According to the timestamps, some photos were taken simultaneously, showing the house existing in multiple places at once. The Blackwoods didn't just move their house, Dr. Chen explained, his voice dropping to a whisper. They transformed it into a kind of dimensional anchor, allowing them to exist outside of normal space-time. But the process created something else, a sort of consciousness within the architecture itself. The house isn't just moving, Mr. Morrison. It's hunting. He pulled out an old journal, its pages filled with sketches of impossible geometric patterns. Every person who's investigated the house over the past century has disappeared. The house appears closer to their home each day until a loud creak from somewhere above us made us both jump. Dr. Chen's face went pale as he looked at his watch. "It's happening faster than I thought," he muttered, rushing to his window. Outside, where there had been an empty lot just hours ago, stood the Blackwood house, its windows dark and uninviting. "It's never appeared this close to my office before. It knows we're talking about it." As he spoke, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The house was slowly rotating, degree by degree, until its front door faced directly toward us. The air in the office grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Dr. Chen frantically gathered his research materials, shoving them into my arms. "You need to leave now," he insisted, his eyes wild with fear. "The pattern in your daily route, it's creating a complex geometric shape around the city. Each appearance of the house is like a point on a ritual circle, and you've been completing it every morning with your deliveries. They're using you, using your routine to power something unthinkable." As I turned to leave, Dr. Chen grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in with desperate strength. "Whatever you do, don't enter the house, no matter what you see in the windows, no matter who calls out to you. Stay outside. The Blackwoods aren't dead." "Mr. Morrison, they're trapped in the spaces between spaces, and they're looking for a way back. They need a living anchor to complete their return. Someone whose movements through space are predictable, repeated, routine." His voice trailed off as we both realized he was describing my daily paper route perfectly. That night, I sat in my living room with Dr. Chen's research spread around me like a paper fortress. The more I read, the more I understood why the house had chosen me. My route wasn't just a delivery path. It was a perfect geometric pattern that, when traced on a map, created an ancient symbol the Blackwoods had used in their dimensional experiments. Every morning for 15 years, I had unknowingly been reinforcing this pattern, strengthening whatever supernatural geometry kept the house tethered to our reality. The realization made me feel sick, used, like a puppet who had never seen its own strings. Sleep came in fitful bursts, filled with dreams of endless hallways and doors that opened onto infinite darkness. When I jolted awake at 3 a.m., something felt different about my apartment. The walls seemed further away than they should be, the corners not quite meeting at right angles. I got up to get a glass of water, but when I reached my kitchen, I froze. Through my window, where there should have been a view of the street below, I saw the Blackwood house standing impossibly close, its highest windows level with my third-floor apartment. As I watched, paralyzed, a light flickered on in one of its rooms. The silhouette that appeared in the window made my heart stop. It was my own shape, dressed in my delivery uniform, turning slowly to face me. But where its face should have been, there was only a swirling darkness, like a miniature galaxy of absolute black. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, but the noise seemed muffled, as if the air itself was becoming thicker. The walls of my apartment began to ripple like water, and I could feel reality bending around me. The Blackwood house wasn't just outside anymore. It was trying to absorb my living space into itself. I ran for my front door, but each step seemed to take me further away from it. The hallway stretched like taffy, the floor beneath my feet becoming the worn hardwood I recognized from the Victorian's interior. Family photographs on my walls transformed before my eyes, the faces in them slowly morphing into strange, twisted versions of the Blackwood family. In one, I saw myself standing among them, dressed in 19th century clothes, my eyes as black as the spaces between stars. The date on the photograph read 1879, but the paper looked brand new. A voice called out from somewhere inside my apartment, or was it inside the house, speaking words that seemed to slither through the air rather than travel through it. "Your route is almost complete," it said, using the voices of 1,000 people speaking in perfect unison. "The pattern lacks only its final point. And you have been such a faithful cartographer." The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on the windows, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like screaming faces. Through the ice, I could see other versions of my apartment overlapping with this one, each showing a different moment in time. I made it to my bedroom and slammed the door, pressing my back against it as reality continued to unravel around me. My phone showed no signal, and when I tried to turn on the lights, the bulbs exploded in a shower of glass and darkness. In the sudden quiet that followed, I heard footsteps approaching, the slow, deliberate sound of someone who has all the time in the world, because I realized with growing horror, time itself was just another dimension for the house to fold and manipulate. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and a hand that felt exactly like my own, but wasn't, began to turn the knob. The door opened with a sound like reality tearing, and I found myself face to face with myself. But this version of me was wrong in subtle, horrifying ways. Its movements were too smooth, as if it was gliding rather than walking, and its skin had a translucent quality that revealed swirling patterns of darkness beneath. "We've waited so long for someone like you," it said with my voice, but layered with countless others. Someone who understands the importance of patterns, of routine, of visiting the same places day after day, until the boundaries between here and there become thin enough to pierce. In that moment, I understood why the Blackwoods had chosen my route, why they had waited 15 years for this exact moment. The house hadn't been moving randomly. It had been following a complex mathematical equation, appearing at precisely calculated points along my paper route to create a vast geometric pattern across Burlington. With each delivery, I had been unwittingly strengthening the boundaries of their dimensional prison, making it possible for them to finally break through. The other version of me smiled, and in its teeth I saw the infinite spaces between dimensions. The walls of my bedroom began to fade, revealing the interior of the Blackwood house beyond them. But it wasn't just one version of the house. It was hundreds, thousands, all existing simultaneously in different locations and times, through windows that shouldn't exist. I saw myself delivering papers at every house on my route, each version of me adding another thread to the Blackwood's grand design. The house had never needed to move. It had always existed in all places at once. What I had seen as movement was simply the house revealing different facets of its impossible geometry. My doppelganger reached out with a hand that rippled like smoke. "Your final delivery," it said, holding out a newspaper that seemed to be made of living shadows. The headlines shifted and changed as I watched, showing stories from past, present, and futures that would never be. I recognized the pattern now. Every house on my route, when connected in the order of my deliveries, formed a complex sigil that the Blackwoods had spent over a century trying to complete. They hadn't been trying to break out of their dimensional prison. They had been trying to pull our entire reality in with them. In a moment of desperate clarity, I remembered what Dr. Chen had said about the pattern needing to be perfect, unbroken. With trembling hands, I reached out and took the shadowy newspaper, watching as my fingers began to become as translucent as my doubles. But instead of completing the final delivery, I tore the paper in half, destroying the last connection point in their dimensional diagram. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Reality snapped back like a rubber band, the overlapping versions of the house shrieking as they were torn apart by the backlash of their own spatial manipulation. The Blackwood house began to collapse in on itself, not physically, but dimensionally, folding inward through spaces that human minds were never meant to comprehend. As it disappeared, taking my doppelganger with it, I caught one last glimpse through a window that opened onto 1879. The Blackwood family stood frozen in their parlor, their faces contorted in eternal screams as they realized their attempt to transcend space and time had become their eternal prison. The house vanished with a sound like the universe taking a deep breath, leaving me alone in my perfectly normal bedroom, holding a perfectly normal newspaper for tomorrow's route. But now I know why we say home delivery, because every house, no matter where it exists, needs its daily paper, even if it has to bend reality itself to get it.